All right. So, a very good evening to all of you. I'm so glad that many of you are here for this discussion, which will be a very specific and a brief discussion on bail law related matters with respect to the proceedings regarding the bail application of Safura Zargar. Therefore, a few basic pointers that I need to sort of make, right? So I am taking Safura Zargar's recent bail applications and the proceedings before the courts as only a platform to bring up certain issues that I will talk about, certain points that I will argue. Just as a platform, I am taking Safura Zargar's case. The point I want to make is all that I'm going to discuss can very well be utilized, in my opinion, in other UAPA related cases which are very similar to Safura's case. Not just the relation in terms of the fact that allegations against other accused persons are under the UAPA, but also similarity to Safura's case concerning her peculiar circumstance about her pregnancy, which is also a very particular aspect with regard to her case, right? So let us view all the points that we are going to discuss not in any narrow sense with respect to Safura's case, but in a more larger sense, okay, where we can apply it to all kinds of UAPA cases, right? So with that rider, I want us to sort of start that the discussions with that broader understanding the fact that we are going to discuss certain points which can be very well argued and utilized in other similar UAPA related matters. All right. So I know that, I'm sure all of you briefly know about the procedural history of Safura's case, right? But nonetheless, I think for my selfish purpose, for me to get a flow to sort of move ahead, I will begin with a short description of the case's procedural history about her bail applications and her arrest, etc., right? Just to get a contextual background. So something that all of us commonly know is that it is in the last week of February 2020, probably starting from February 23rd, that northeastern parts of Delhi witnessed unfortunate scenes of violence caused because of the conflict between anti-CAA and pro-CAA protesters. And it's on the basis of these violent incidents that several FIRs were registered by the police, right? Different branches of the police, different police stations. So it is on April 10th of 2020 that Safura got arrested for the first time by the Delhi police in connection to these North Delhi riots case. All right. On April 10th, she was arrested by the police in connection with an FIR. To be very specific, FIR number 48 of 2020, filed by the Jafrabad police station. This FIR was particularly for alleged crimes under the IPC, like obstruction of a public servant who is on duty, assault of a public servant who is on duty, a wrongful restraint, etc. These were the three major broad heads of the crimes that were registered under this particular FIR filed by the Jafrabad police station. Right now, her first bail application was filed by her lawyers on April 11th itself, the very next day after her arrest. So after the 24 hours, which is the constitutional deadline, at which the police can detain somebody without the authorization of the magistrate. So immediately after that, her lawyers filed that bail application, right? This bail application, which was filed on April 11th, was listed 2 days later, that is on April 30th. And on April 13th, one second guys, I just need to accept. All right, so sorry for the delay. So on April 13th, the concerned magistrate conducted a special sitting in the Mandoli jail where Safura was detained. This special sitting happened in the jail, keeping in mind the COVID-19 lockdown and to ensure, social distancing. So therefore, the courts were not functioning, because of which these sittings were happening in the jails itself, right? So in that special sitting, she was granted bail on April 13th. Mind you, this is with respect to an FIR number 48 of 2020 filed in the Jafrabad police station for offences that I have mentioned before. Fortunately or unfortunately, on the same day, or I think the next day after April 13, she was arrested again by the Delhi Crime Branch with respect to the crimes alleged under FIR number 59 of 2020, which was registered by the Crime Branch Department of the Police. This FIR was registered by the Crime Branch on March 6th, that is a month ago. On March 6th, they had filed this FIR, wherein the prime accused was the JNU student Umar Khalid. He was the prime accused for hatching a conspiracy to spread the riots. Right? It is in that FIR under which Safura was again rearrested, even though she was given bail in a previous FIR. Right? She was rearrested there. So this is the initial arrest history in Safura's case. And it is in the subsequent FIR, that is FIR number 59, right, that the police had registered crimes not just under the IPC, but also they had alleged crimes under the UAPA, which is the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act of 1967. It is that happened in the second FIR, not in the first FIR. Once she was arrested under the subsequent FIR, that's when her journey with the bail applications, started facing trouble before the additional sessions judge of the Patiala House Courts Complex in Delhi, Judge Dharmender Rana, who denied her bail application on June 4th, 2020. Right? So that's when she started, finding it difficult to get her bail application, granted or processed and granted by the courts for the first time. Now, all of you know what happened on June 4th with the Sessions Court, Judge Dharmender Rana denying her bail, and that proceedings were well highlighted and well documented and transcribed by these organizations like Live Law, Bar and Bench, and certain other lawyers, right? But what I want to focus is not on the the overall aspects of that particular case. So because ever since that order came out by the Sessions Judge Dharmender Rana on June 4th, several lawyers and scholars have already written quite a few specific essays and blog posts critiquing that bail order's soundness, especially I would say from the points of view with respect to constitutional law and the interpretation of the UAPA's provisions independently. Most importantly, these works by several scholars and lawyers have stated that the denial of bail to Safura was wrong in law, as it violated the freedom of speech standards set by constitutional law judgments given by our Supreme Court and several other high courts. In this talk, I am not intending to touch upon those angles of constitutional law based critique of this bail order of the Sessions Judge. No. Instead, what I am going to do is I will use an argument that has already been made by some writers who critiqued the particular bail order given by the Sessions Judge. I'm going to use that argument to create another argument which has not been discussed at all either in the court proceedings nor in any of the academic literature that came after these bail orders, right? So the argument is, so we know, sorry, I would request whosoever's mic is on, please, mute yourself. Okay. So what we need to know is a background idea of what the UAPA is, right? The Unlawful Activities Prevention Act 1967 is our primary legislation governing terrorist-based crimes, terrorism-based crimes as well as terrorist organizations-based crimes, And also, it is in the same legislation that we have criminalized certain, unlawful activities, the definition of which is quite vague and quite broad, I would say, right? Now, this is a very special legislation, special in the sense it is talking about certain specific kinds of crime. It is not talking about your A to Z crimes, which is done by your IPC, which is why IPC is called as a general criminal law. Now, the deal with such special laws, that are created to, criminalize certain special kinds of activities, there is another leeway that is given to them. The leeway is that to deal with certain such specific crimes, you can create your own special procedures to deal with it. Why is that important? Because by default, when a crime happens, its investigation to its prosecution to its, the end of the case by the trial court with the judgment of conviction or acquittal is governed by your overarching code called as the Criminal Procedure Code, the 1973 code. If IPC is your general substantive criminal law, your CRPC is your general procedural criminal law. But a UAPA, or for another example, the Fugitive Economic Offenders Act, these are special legislations which can get that authority to create certain specific procedural treatment for its own crimes, which is maybe it may be different from that of CRPCs. In fact, the CRPC itself allows that, by the way. The CRPC itself in its section 4, if I may read that out for you, section 4 subsection 2 of CRPC says, all offences under any other law shall be investigated, inquired into, tried and otherwise dealt with according to the same provisions, that is the same provisions of the CRPC, but subject to any enactment for the time being in force regulating the manner or place of investigation or trial dealing with such offences. So that's why I call CRPC as that, that benevolent law which sort of, gives its way, which doesn't have its ego to say that, I will, rule over all kinds of procedures, regardless of whether it is a special crime or a general crime. CRPC doesn't do that, right? But ever since, 1950s and 1960s, the Supreme Court has categorically held that, while the special laws create their own, special procedures, you can't give a, free rider there, right? You can't allow them to completely overturn the CRPC and create a new procedural system that is, far away from what the CRPC's base is. That's why, the very famous constitutional law judgment in Anwar Ali Sarkar's case, right? One of the initial judgments of the Supreme Court of India post-independence, where they said that, when such special laws create a new kind of a procedure to deal with their own offenses or their crimes, you better ensure that you don't deviate from the basic core principles and practices under the CRPC. Because in CRPC, there are certain substantive, provisions or certain substantive factors which are there for a purpose, right? So therefore, you can't deviate from that. But there are certain other, intermediary or supplementary processes which can actually be flexed and molded according to different situations. That's the first starting point that we need to understand about the UAPA. So very well, UAPA kept in mind the principle of Anwar Ali Sarkar. UAPA created a special procedural mechanisms in certain areas with respect to unlawful activities and terrorism based crimes under the UAPA. So what it did is, it did not completely get rid away with the CRPC. Of course, if it did so, it would have gone against the precedent of Anwar Ali Sarkar. That has not happened, by the way. What the UAPA has done is, in certain parts, it has modified the application of the CRPC to its crimes, but not entirely. That's something that I want to sort of take you to. But before I do that, one thing that we need to categorically understand, this is where I said I will use an argument that has already been made by certain lawyers. For example, one of the better pieces that I saw on the Sessions Judge's bail order in Safura's case was Manu Sebastian's piece in Live Law. In Live Law, lawyer Manu Sebastian had written a good piece where he made a very good argument in light of the Sessions Court's bail order. So, according to the Sessions Court's bail order, the evidences presented by the police/prosecution clearly, categorically states that Safura and her co-accused were directly involved in the conspiracy to do what? In the conspiracy to block the roads in and around the northeastern Delhi area. Specific point of area is the Jafrabad metro station and the nearby locality. From the WhatsApp messages and other correspondences, as per the police's argument, there was a clear conspiracy to block the road, which is what the Judge also relies on to say that, that's prima facie case enough. Therefore, Safura's bail was denied. Now, the reason why, Judge Dharmender Rana could say so is because there is a very peculiar provision in the UAPA, which I will show you in a slide right now, called section 43D. More specifically, subsection 5 of section 43D is this, overhyped provision, I would say. I see it as a very overhyped provision. I'll tell you why. What 43D5 says is, if the bail applicant before the court is accused of offences under the UAPA, not all the offences under the UAPA, by the way, let us recall that. If you are accused in the FIR or in the complaint or whichever other source, if you are accused of offences under chapter 4 and chapter 6 of the UAPA, please note down these chapter numbers for your later reference. So if you are accused of offences under chapter 4 and chapter 6 of the UAPA, then in such cases, for such applicants, the bail may be denied by the court if there is a prima facie case which shows that they were part of that particular crime. Right? Now, this is peculiar because in general principles of bail law, we always discuss that the gravity of the offense nor the merits of the case are relevant to decide whether a person should get bail or not. This is the matter of general principles of bail law for your theft, for your pickpocketing in IPC and general offense. So in UAPA, they come and make this provision which says, if chapter 4 and chapter 6 wala offense, if you are accused of that, then there is an additional requirement that needs to be fulfilled. That is, if the prosecution is able to prove that there is a prima facie case against you for the offences committed under chapter 4 and 6, then bail can be denied to you, even if you are not going to, hamper the investigation, even if you are not going to be a flight risk, even if you are not going to abscond, that's what I meant, right? Or even if you are not in a position to threaten or influence the witnesses involved in that case. Despite all those factors, if there is a prima facie case, you can be denied. People have overhyped this particular, provision. I would say it's a misinterpretation. They have overhyped this provision to say that, this provision makes bail impossible in all UAPA cases, which is wrong. As I have been repeatedly saying, it's not all UAPA cases. Chapter 4, chapter 6 wala offences. As I was introducing the UAPA, I said, UAPA is our prime legislation to talk about terror-related offences, terrorist organizations-based offences. Chapter 4 talks about terrorist activities and related crimes. Chapter 6 talks about terrorist organizations-based crimes. That is your membership in an organization, your contributions to an organization which promotes terrorism, things like that. Now, the idea is, apart from chapter 4 and chapter 6, the UAPA has certain other offences, which is your other large category in the UAPA, which is the unlawful activities. Unlawful activities based crimes are, criminalized and designated and written about not in chapter 4 or not in chapter 6 of the UAPA, but in certain other chapters of the UAPA. The UAPA was specific when it wrote section 43D subsection 5 that this additional requirement on bail of a prima facie case being made against you is only applicable to terrorist activities crimes as well as terrorist organizations based crimes. Now, if you look at it, if you take that interpretation and take it to Safura's case, taking the police's side only, taking the court side itself, the entire conspiracy that the prosecution was able to prove is that there was a conspiracy to block the roads in that particular area, which the court then expanded to say that, such a conspiracy, puts the entire city to lockdown and that is troublesome. Therefore, it is an unlawful activity. As per the arguments of the police, I'm not even looking at the defense lawyers now. As per the arguments of the police and as per the recordings, the observations by the judge, the offences for which, at least even for the sake of argument, if I say that there is a prima facie case against Safura, it is only for unlawful activities based crimes under the UAP, not terrorist activities crimes, not terrorist organizations based crimes. There was no single evidence given by the prosecution or the police to say that she was part of a terrorist organization, or to say that there were a conspiracy to hatch a terrorist activity in Delhi. There was nothing. Unlawful activity is the remaining allegation against her. Now, the argument is, in such a situation, to Safura's case, section 43D, subsection 5 does not apply at all. Right? Therefore, that embargo of section 43D5 doesn't appear in at all to deny her bail on that particular ground, which in fact the judge used. I'll tell you a very practical side to it. If there are practicing lawyers in this meeting, they would definitely know about it. That most of our trial court judges, when I say trial court judges, I'm talking about the magistrates and the sessions judges. This is a very practical observation. They have a tendency to just deny bail using this 43D5 argument by saying that, oh, it's a UAPA case. That's very troublesome. That generalization is troublesome when you disregard the nuanced distinction between chapter 4, chapter 6 and the unlawful activities offences. So you need to have chapter 4 and chapter 6 offences on one side, which is the most grievous out of the lot, which is why that additional embargo is there on bail. Makes sense. Proportionality comes in play there. But unlawful activities form a different category for which that embargo is not there. So the UAPA is a very, I would say, as far as this particular provision, others will have arguments against the UAPA, from a very general point of view. But as far as section 43D5, which is about the bail application there, bail applications of UAPA accused persons there, that embargo is not there for a case like Safura's case. That's very, very important that we sort of keep it in mind. Right? Now, the other point is, right? The other point that I want to focus, which is something that I said, people have not raised in the court proceedings, nor in the academic literature that was produced after the Sessions Court judgment. That is, if you look at it, right, the misconceived notion that I was telling earlier, that it's an overhyped provision in the UAPA, and the misconception behind that, right, is that in a UAPA case, the CRPC has no relevance at all, right? CRPC is a general law. Therefore, UAPA crimes are very specific, specific crimes, which are specifically regulated by the UAPA provisions. And therefore, don't bring in principles of CRPC to, justify or to argue against bail in UAPA matters. That is a completely wrong argument. This is where I'll open a slideshow, which is where I want us to understand the language and the text used in section 43D5, section 43D fully, and also in a related provision in the CRPC. Just give me a second till I can open that particular slide. All right. I'm hoping that you can see the slide. Can anybody come on the mic and give me a yes?
Yes, sir.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So, in the first few slides, I want to sort of talk about section 43D of the UAP. Right? Let's go skim through the provisions to understand the nature of the UAPA, the relevant provision of the UAPA, and then we'll go to the CRPC. So here I have excerpted section 43D, which talks about, look at the language, modified application of certain provisions of the code. Now the code refers to the CRPC, okay. So the UAPA uses the word code to refer to the CRPC. That's defined in their definitions. So modified application of only certain provisions of the code. That means, that's what I said in the beginning. The special law, which is the UAPA in this case, has not fully disregarded your general law, the CRPC, but it has only tweaked one or two provisions here and there. Let us take a look at which are those provisions. Subsection 1 of 43D, notwithstanding anything contained in the code, CRPC, or any other law, every offence punishable under this act shall be deemed to be a cognizable offence within the meaning of clause C of section 2 of the code, and cognizable of case as defined in that clause shall be construed accordingly. Now, this is definitely a modification of the CRPC, because CRPC doesn't treat all IPC offences as cognizable offences. There is this very broad classification into cognizable and non-cognizable offences. In fact, that's the first major lesson that any student learns in a CRPC class, I believe. Right? I'm not getting into on what basis this classification is done. But UAPA comes and says, cognizable offences which are more seriously, viewed in the law. UAPA is saying that, see, offences under my legislation is very serious. Therefore, I want all of them to be cognizable. I don't want the non-cognizable business. So therefore, okay, fine. We have, modified that particular aspect of the CRPC in subsection 1. Got it. Subsection 2, look at it. Section 167 of the code of the CRPC shall apply in relation to a case involving an offence punishable under this act, subject to the modification that in subsection 2, so and so shall be added. So, if I can proceed, section 167 of the CRPC, to give you a brief idea, talks about this very, very important process in criminal procedural law called the remand process. Right? It has within its fold the remand process as well as the concept of the right to default bail in the CRPC. Right? It's a very, very important aspect, talking about the detention of an accused person during the investigation stage. What is the authority of the magistrate to authorize further detention of an accused post that constitutionally authorized 24 hours of police custody? Right? So it fixes certain time limits, like, it says that for certain offences very serious in terms of the punishment given to them, an accused person can be kept in custody for 90 days. The deal is, within 90 days, if the police doesn't file the charge sheet, which is the end of an investigation, which is the official end of an investigation, then that person will be released on bail. Right? This is what 167 does. Now, what UAPA does is, UAPA is like, see, we have already told you that our offences are very serious. See, more serious the offence, matlab, we need more time to investigate. 90 days is insufficient for us. So therefore, we are modifying section 167 by saying that for UAPA cases, the limit need not be 90 days for the police to finish the investigation and file the charge sheet. The limit can extend up to 180 days, straight double, right? That's the modification that they do in subsection 2 of section 43D. Again, what I want you to observe as we go through is, these are very specific modifications that the UAPA is making, and I really like what they're doing, in the sense, they are being very specific and very to the point. They are not saying that, okay, 167 not applicable. No, they are not saying that. Right? So let's keep that in mind. Third subsection of, sorry for that. Third subsection of section 43D amends or modifies the application of section 268 of the code. Right? 268 of the CRPC is modified in the following manner. It is modified in the following manner here to be applied to UAPA cases. Right? Again, a very specific modification of a provision in the CRPC. So till now you see three things being modified. The distinction the CRPC creates between cognizable and non-cognizable. Section 167 is modified in a very small way to the UAPA. Subsection 3 of section 43D modifies section 268 of the CRPC. Subsection 4, I am hovering through subsection 4, if you can notice. Subsection 4 says nothing in section 438 of the CRPC or the code shall apply in relation to any case, any case under the UAPA. Section 438 of the CRPC students and practicing lawyers would definitely know. It's the provision that talks about anticipatory bail in the CRPC. Anticipatory bail is a very extraordinary remedy that you have to get bail in advance of your arrest. Typically, the concept of bail becomes relevant only once you are arrested and your liberty is curtailed by the state. But anticipatory bail becomes extraordinary because it gives you a ready-made advance bail before the arrest actually happens. Now, UAPA is coming and saying that 438 doesn't apply to us. That again is a specific provision being taken away from its application to UAPA. Now coming to the most important part. Subsection 5, this is the most important provision. Subsection 5 of Section 435D of the UAPA. Notwithstanding anything contained in the code, no person accused of an offence punishable under Chapter 4 and Chapter 6 of this Act shall, if in custody, be released on bail unless the public prosecutor has been given an opportunity of being heard. So it's a very simple procedural requirement here. Chapter 4 and 6 wala offender or an accused who is accused of offences under Chapter 4 and 6, when he or she applies for bail, in that process, it can't be an ex parte hearing. It has to be an adversarial hearing between the lawyer for the bail applicant and the public prosecutor who represents the police, the state. Right? This is something that is there. Now, a proviso is there. A proviso paragraph is there for subsection 5. Right? Provided that such accused person shall not be released on bail if the court, on perusal of the case diary or the report made under section 173, is of the opinion that there are reasonable grounds for believing that the accusation against such person is prima facie true. Mind you, this proviso, if you can observe the indentation, this proviso is applicable only to subsection 5 of section 43D in the UAP. That means the word such accused person that I am highlighting now in the proviso is the such accused person who is accused of the offence under Chapter 4 and 6 of the Act of the UAP. That is terrorist and terrorist organizations based crimes. Not an accused under the UAPA who is accused of an unlawful activity. Right? This is the argument that I was talking about earlier. Right? So what I want to specify here is, I'm not going to sort of waste time by reading the other subsections of 43D of the UAPA. What we have read till now is more than enough to make the argument that I want to make. A special law, when it does not specifically exclude a provision of the general law, you can underline it and say that in such a scenario, that general law, as long as it is not precluded by the special law's application, will be applicable. That means for those accused persons under the UAPA who are not accused of a crime under chapters 4 and 6 of the UAPA, prime example, Safura Zargar, now that we are in that platform. Such a person is not bound by this embargo of the reasonable grounds for believing that accusation against a person is prima facie true. No. Instead, she can be made subject to the principles and the remedies given in the CRPC itself. I'll take you through that now. All the other aspects of the bail law that is given in the CRPC, which is of course a general law, which is an overarching law, until and unless it is expressly excluded by the special law, which we have seen, most parts of CRPC have not been excluded by the UAPA anywhere. If you look at subsection 6 and subsection 7 as well, it is also talking about certain very specific changes. Right? Now I'll tell you why Safura could have been subject to the remedies and the principles of bail law that has been evolved ever since the code came in 1973 and through case law thereafter. which allows a lot of rights and strategies that a person, a bail applicant, can rely upon in such situations, even though their larger offense is covered by a special legislation. This is where I want to go to section 437 of the CRPC. Right? This is where I want to sort of now, introduce you to this particular provision of the CRPC. Section 437 is the provision in the CRPC which talks about bail in cases of non-bailable offences. As you can see from the language of section 437 subsection 1, when any person accused of or suspected of the commission of any non-bailable offence is arrested or detained without warrant or is brought before a court other than the High Court or the Court of Session, he may be released on bail. Yeah, then there is a but which talks about certain conditions, certain exceptions, certain such exceptional scenarios, right? So, an unlawful activity under the UAPA, which does not fall under chapter 6 and chapter 4, is definitely a non-bailable offence, keeping in mind the the general trend that any offence more than 3 years generally is a non-bailable offence. In fact, I don't need to even go to that extent because UAPA says that all the offences are non-bailable. Therefore, a case like Safuras, which was not specifically talked about in section 43D subsection 5, can be subjected to the rules and regulations in this particular provision, section 437, because section 437 is the general provision in the CRPC that talks about all matters of bail with respect to non-bailable offences, right? Until and unless a special legislation makes an exception, which we have seen in the reading of section 43D5 of the UAPA. Safuras case or any person who is similarly situated to Safuras case can be brought under that particular ambit. Sorry, cannot be brought under the particular ambit of chapter 4 or chapter 6 of the UAPA, right? This is section 437. Now, if I move to another part of section 437, these are certain proviso paragraphs that are there in section 437, which talks about certain very important references that we can make. That is, provided that the court may direct that a person referred to in clause 1 or clause 2 be released on bail if such person is under the age of 16 years or is a woman or is sick or infirm. We need to sort of make a categorical reflection here. This is a proviso which says that, CRPC also, what I did not sort of particularly refer to, had a provision which said that, if you are a habitual offender, that is, if you have been already committed in another crime in the past, and now you are being, you have been arrested in another case today, your past criminal history can be a reason to deny you bail, right? It also, CRPC section 437(1) also says that, if there is, if it appears to the judge that, there is reasonable ground to believe that you are, accused, sorry, you have committed a crime for which the punishment is more than life imprisonment or death, then bail can be denied to you. But these provisos that you can see listed down here in this particular slide gives certain exceptions to such scenarios. That is, even if I am somebody who is a habitual offender, but I fall under any of these exceptional scenarios provided by these proviso paragraphs, then I can, a leniency can be shown to me. First proviso clauses. The court may direct, court may, I want you to specifically look at the highlights that I have given. Court may, that is, of course, the discretion of the court. A person referred to in clause 1 or clause 2 is the habitual offender or the reasonable ground to believe, the clauses that I just mentioned. Such person may be released on bail if he or she is either under the age of 16 years, or even if you are not under the age of 16 years, if you are a woman by birth, that is also a clause. Or if you are sick, or if you are infirm. Sickness in the sense that we are not talking about a common cold or something like that. We are talking about life-threatening sickness. Infirmity is in the sense of, I would say, non-physical health that we are talking about, probably mental health that we are talking about. The CRPC creates such provisions for, persons who are dealing with mental disabilities and other mental health issues. Now, a brief, very, very overarching, perspective on this particular proviso, this first proviso. I completely, disagree with the way that this old colonial provision has been sort of legislated. The tone of categorizing women as a general category, along with minors, along with sick persons, along with infirm persons. That for me is a very, patently observable feature of romantic paternalism that you see in such old legislations, which are, still based on certain colonial aspects, colonial theories. Anyway, keeping aside that particular argument, which can be one entire another session, if there is a judge who can righteously interpret the law, and that's what I call as righteous judicial activism, where you interpret the law to make a more commonsensical interpretation and to getting a commonsensical result, and keeping away certain unreasonability out of that interpretation. The leniency given to women or the leniency given to sick persons can be interpreted in a manner in Safura's case by saying that, first of all, by saying that, Safura is, authorized or is entitled to rely on this leniency given in the CRPC. Why? Because, as we said, she is not bound by section 43D subsection 5. Therefore, she can be subjected to the rights and liabilities in the CRPC as well. So don't give her bail because just because she is a woman. She could be given that leniency in terms of bail because she is having a biological condition which only women can have currently as we speak, biologically speaking, right? Pregnancy is a biological condition which only women can have right now. So interpret the phrase women in the restricted manner of a woman carrying certain conditions which only she can carry. Right? That ground. It's a ground that is there in the law in itself. As we are going to speak about, it's no humanitarian ground that we are talking about. Yeah, it can be a humanitarian ground that is legislated in the law, to which I am saying that Safura or similarly placed persons can be brought under and can be given that entitlement. I'm sure you wouldn't, if you read the Sessions Court judgment, or if you, read the Delhi High Court judgment that came, you wouldn't see any discussion on section 437. That is why I said this particular theory or this particular line of argument has not been tested in our courts in any of these proceedings in Safura's case. That's something very, very importantly that we need to keep in mind. It's not just a matter of criminal procedural law that I'm talking here. It's a matter of interpretation of the law, where you have a special law and then you have a general law, right? It's not that, yeah, there is this very, simplistic saying, I would say, a very simplistic saying that most law students know. Special law prevails over general law. That has nuances underneath it. By default, yes. But the nuanced principles underneath are that yes, a special law will prevail over a general law as long as it is specifically excluded. Otherwise, no. Right? And that's why the title of section 43D of the UAPA makes a lot of sense. Modified application of certain provisions of the CRPC. Certain provisions. Section 437 proviso, paragraph 1, which I just read out about the the leniency that could be shown to certain kinds of people who are applicants of bail has not been specifically excluded by the UAPA, right? So therefore, let's keep that in mind before we move forward. Having said this, this is where I want to, before I move to the last bit of my discussion, I want you to carry forward this thought in mind about the interplay between the CRPC and the UAPA, and the fact that, certain things have been legislated already in the law. You don't need to go into any other, jurisprudence or philosophy or some sociological humanitarian principles to give or deny bail to somebody. Having said that, moving from the Sessions Court's judgment or order on the bail application filed by Safura, moving to what happened 3 days back. In fact, if I have to tell you about the history of the Delhi High Court proceedings, let me tell you, the proceedings did not, get concluded on June 24th. The proceedings had started, so it got concluded on June 24th. It did not start on June 24th. It started on June 18th. On June 18th, the Delhi High Court had issued notice to the Delhi police, right, to submit a ATR. ATR, for your benefit, if you don't know the full form of it, it's called as the action taken report. I don't know, certain places of India, it might have certain colloquial terms to it, but generally in English it is called as action taken report. Action taken reports are filed by the police time to time whenever the court asks for it to know the updates on the particular on the investigation in a particular case. Typically done in matters where there is a complaint before the magistrates saying that the police has not filed the FIR. That's a typical situation where action taken reports are always asked by the courts from the police. Another situation is bail applications, because that's very important, because a bail application is normally tested and understood in terms of the requirements of the investigation, because bail is never a punitive tool that is there in the hands of the state or the courts. Bail law is not at all on the basis of the fact that, oh, you have committed a grave offense, or you seem to be, guilty of this offense, therefore we will deny you bail. No, it doesn't happen like that. Bail is always on the basis of what is your capacity in different senses. The main important aspect is what is your capacity to, derail the investigation if we let you out free in the society. Will you tamper with the evidences? Will you, destroy some evidences? Will you go on, intimidating the witnesses involved in the case, thereby, encouraging them to not give the truth to the police and the court? If yes, we will not give you bail. For this, they will of course look at your, standing in the society, your influence in the society. Also, another major factor is, will you abscond? Will you abscond outside our country? Because if you abscond, then proper investigation cannot happen without interrogating you. Later on, trial can also not start, because in India we don't currently have a concept of in absentia trial. Without the accused being in, there in person, or now in COVID-19 times, at least in virtual presence, trials cannot move forward in criminal law, right? And in fact, that is one of the major reasons why our trials get stuck in the courts. Again, practicing lawyers would definitely know more about that. The majority of the main reason for the trials getting stuck is because the accused is absconding. So the lack of presence of the accused. So to avoid all of that, bail can be denied, right? So this is the reason why an action taken report is important, so that the judge, by looking at the stage of investigation, etc., can determine what needs to be done in that particular case. Because if the investigation is at a very nascent stage, usually bail is not given, because evidences will be at large in the society. Therefore, if you leave, the accused might just go and tamper with it, might destroy it. But if investigation is fully complete, then the accused may be given bail. But why? Because now there is no scope for anything like that to happen. Investigation is already over. Now this person can be let out, right? So that is why an action taken report is important. So on June 18th, coming back to Safoura's case. So June 4th, again revisiting the timeline. June 4th, she was denied bail by the Sessions Court. She's continuing to remain in detention in the Tihar jail. In the meanwhile, her legal team again files for an application in the higher court, in the Delhi High Court, right? That is again section 439 of the CRPC playing out there. Now, in this situation, June 18th, notice issued to the police saying file the ATR on June 23rd. June 18th to June 23, almost 5 days are there. I want you to keep those 5 days in mind. Very, very important. 5 days are there. The judge waits for June 23rd. Justice Rajiv's court in Delhi High Court. June 23rd, the court convenes for hearing. Delhi police is represented by Solicitor General Tushar Mehta and also by Additional Solicitor General Aman Lekhi. If you are interested, there is a parallel discussion that is going on about, why is the Solicitor General or the Additional Solicitor General representing the Delhi police? Because Delhi police already had certain other standing councils and all. So that's a discussion that I'm not going to entertain here. But for those interested, you should read about that as well. Anyway, on June 23rd, Solicitor General started the hearing by saying this, that we need an adjournment to take instructions from the police. I mean, that was a time that was given to you, 5 days. We had, I'm talking in the language of the judge. We had given you 5 days on June 18th when we issued notice in the bail application of Safoura Zargar, and we gave you 5 days to file an action taken report. And that 5 days is there for you to take instructions from the police. After 5 days, you are saying and coming and saying that we need another day or two for taking instructions and coming back to the court. Of course, the defense objected to that. The response by the Solicitor General was that, we are not, it's not that we are not ready to argue on the merits of the bail application. Right? It's not that we are not ready. We are ready. We are ready to argue on the merits of the bail application. Of course, we are ready to object to it. But no, we want to take instructions from our client. Of course, their client is the Delhi police. Anyway, that procedural futility is something that, as upcoming lawyers and students and already practicing lawyers, we need to definitely note down. Now, mind you, the Delhi police filed the action taken report on June 23rd. Just that the hearing did not happen on June 23rd. Upon the Solicitor General's submission that we need adjournment, Justice Rajiv gave that adjournment for a day, and the matter was posted again on June 24th. That's why on June 24th, again the matter got convened, and that's where Safoura was given bail. I don't know which word to use. That's the conundrum that I am facing. This is the fact that she was granted bail by the court, or she was just handed over a bail as a gift by the state. So very interesting aspects of what happened on June 24th, the Tuesday, is after all these 5 days given and then another day of adjournment, June 24th, again the Solicitor General starts the argument. First argument is, we are ready to give her bail, but on certain conditions. First is, we are not opposing her bail only on certain humanitarian grounds. We are not ready to, concede the bail on the merits of the bail application. Just a day before, Solicitor General had said that we are ready to fight the bail on merits. But apparently they took instructions. They came on the next day and said that we are ready to accept that she be given bail, but on humanitarian grounds. What is the humanitarian ground that he is making? The Solicitor General is making that fact that she is 5 months pregnant by now, and therefore the stage of pregnancy is at the stage where you need utmost delicate care for the, the pregnant mother. Therefore, on that humanitarian ground, so that she can, have proper medical facilities and care being given to her. Another point which the state's councils, the Solicitor General and the ASG, Aman Lekhi, told was that because it is being given only on humanitarian grounds because she is pregnant, therefore, this is not a bail that is given to her on the merits of the case. Therefore, it should not be a precedent. So the concept of precedent is, not at all uncommon for us common law students, the inheritors of the British common law, right? Especially when you are talking about a constitutional court like the High Court or the Supreme Court, the judgments that they pass, right, typically are binding precedents for the lower courts and also for the co-equal benches, right? But yeah, there are certain situations which I will talk about very briefly, where the judgments or orders by these constitutional courts like the High Court or the Supreme Court can be termed not as a precedent. I'll talk about those specific circumstances. But these are the two conditions which the state put forward by saying that, give her bail, it's okay, we don't have any disagreement. So after 5 days plus 1 day, that is total after 6 days, since the bail application was filed, this is when they are coming and saying that even though we are ready to fight it out on the merits of the bail application, it's okay. We are giving it on humanitarian grounds. Okay. Essentially what they are saying is pregnancy of a woman is not a ground to give that person a leniency as far as bail is concerned. Let's keep that in mind. So that hearing on June 24th, if you follow the transcripts of the hearing, provided by these organizations like Bar and Bench and Live Law, you will see that hearing got quickly concluded. The judge also did not ask many questions beyond this. Judge also recorded the order in that particular manner. It's a crisp, no, I don't know, I mean, I'm not using the word crisp, but it's a 3-page order in which the judge says, Safura is given bail as the state is not opposing the bail to be given on humanitarian grounds. Because the bail is not given on merits of the case, because bail is not given upon the interpretation of the law, therefore, my bail order, which I am now passing, just as Rajiv is saying this, is not going to be precedent for future cases. Therefore, certain conditions were put on Safura. That's a normal practice. When bail is given, it's not like a full-fledged liberty that is given to you. It's a restricted liberty that is given to you. Certain conditions like you can't step out of Delhi without the permission of the court. You have to keep in touch with the investigation officer, on a regular, weekly basis or something. So several such conditions were put as well. Saying all of this, he passed that order, signed it, and disposed it off, and sent a dasti to the jail superintendent, and Safura got released on Wednesday, the next day, after all the formalities were completed. Now, what I want to point out here is the fact that, I was perplexed after reading some of the what is called headlines used by all these news portals like Live Law or Bar and Bench or any other news portals. The portals, the news headline said, Safura granted bail as center agrees. Now the first blockade that I had was as center agrees, meaning if the center did not agree, she would not have been given bail. The tonality is such that it seems like the bail is a matter that is dependent on the state's approval or the lack of it. I think all of us learned in our CRPC classes that bail in bailable cases, which are generally less serious offences, is a matter of automatic right. It's a matter of absolute right. But bail in non-bailable cases is not an automatic right, but it is up to the discretion of whom? Not the state, but the discretion of the court of law, not the court of executives, not the court of the Solicitor General, not the court of Delhi Police, the court of law, starting from your magistrate, session judges to High Court. Now, this is where we need to understand that first of all, bail is never ever a gift given to you by the state. But the tone of the judgment or the tone of the arguments put forward were such that it seemed like so. And it was unfortunate that the court did not, take the case forward on the merits of it. It's startling to know that the Solicitor General, who said that we are ready to fight on merits, but it's okay, we are ready to give her bail on humanitarian grounds. Now, I am confused. As somebody who has read CRPC and UAPA, or generally the principles of law, of bail law specifically, I mean, what is the difference between humanitarian and merits of the case? Humanitarian grounds and merits of the case. As I just showed to you, when we read the slides where I, excerpted the provision section 437 and the UAPA section 43D, the leniency given to certain categories of the society, like elderly people, sick people, infirm people, or minors, and women, is legislated in the law. Now, once a particular right or a particular liability is legislated in the law, then it doesn't merely become, a humanitarian principle. It is a humanitarian factor that has been, transcribed into the legislation through a parliamentary process. Once it is done so, it attains a different level of importance. It gets legal enforceability, of course, upon the discretion of the court, not on the discretion of the state, not on the discretion of the police or the government. For example, I was thinking, right to education. All of us know that right to education, has a very fascinating story in the law. In 2009, that is when it got sort of that legal value and the constitutional value in many ways, right? The amendment was made to the Constitution, Article 21A, by saying what? By saying that age of 6 to 14 years, education is a fundamental right and it's the liability of the state. 21A becomes a fundamental right. Then, of course, a parallel legislation was also created. The Right to Education Act also was created to sort of, to enforce this particular fundamental right. Giving education to all or to a particular category of children of 6 to 14, primary school essentially, of course, is a humanitarian thing to do. It's a matter of the goodness of the humanity that we saw that, okay, now we have decided to give them education. Good of you, good policy. When it gets it into the Constitution, it doesn't merely stay as a humanitarian gift that you have given. Then it becomes a fundamental right that you can claim and enforce it in a court of law. If it is there in the statute, it becomes a legal right that you can claim it by challenging it in the other courts of law. You may want it, if I have to sort of create that nuanced distinction, you may call it a legal humanitarian ground, or you may call it a constitutional -humanitarian ground. But of course, I wouldn't go into that nuanced distinction, because we can't divorce the law from the humanitarian principles once it is legislated, right? Once it is legislated into the law, it becomes a matter of legal right. And as I had argued in the first half of the discussion, the leniency given to women, which generally is something that I do not agree with, as the argument which I made earlier, but a righteous interpretation can be made that that leniency of bail can be given to women who are going through certain biological conditions which only they can go through because of their biological status as a woman. When you do so, that is not merely a humanitarian gift, humanitarian leniency that somebody is showing out of their own discretion or out of their own courtesy. That's something that you are enforcing, which is already there in the law. or some basis is there in the law at least. Right? Therefore, to classify or to categorize the reason for which Safura was given bail, no, as the headline say, because the center agreed, is utterly, that goes against the principles of law, especially the law on bail. Because if I have to talk about the law on bail, the law on bail is essentially humanitarian. I'll give you examples. The law of bail is so peculiar that the way it is there in the CRPC, or the way the courts have modified it. In fact, bail is one such area where the law is more contributed by the courts than the legislation. There is no problem in that because we are a mixed system of common law, civil law. Therefore, that's possible for the case law and the statutory law to coexist together. Bail law, for example, if I have to give certain examples like the right to education analogy that I created, go back to certain cases like Motiram versus State of Madhya Pradesh. Let me ask for an example, take that. Motiram versus Madhya Pradesh was a judgment by the Supreme Court in the late 1970s, where bail was given and the bail condition which the magistrate imposed was 10,000 rupees, the bail bond. For you to be released, you need to execute a bail bond, and the bail bond was set at 10,000 rupees. 1978 I am talking about. It gets more contextual highlight when I say that the petitioner in this case was a mason, a daily wage worker who does mason work of construction of buildings and all. For such a person, 10,000 rupees was unimaginable. He or she has never seen that amount together at once in their lifetime. Therefore, that matter went to the Supreme Court, challenging that Sessions Court's order. Supreme Court gave that person bail and also reduced the bail amount to 1,000 rupees, from 10,000 to 1,000. I don't even 1,000 would have been difficult for that person. But anyway, this was done keeping in mind Section 440 of the CRPC. Section 440 says, when bail bond is set, the amount has to be kept or has to be decided by the judge, keeping in mind the peculiar circumstances of the case, which has been interpreted by the courts to say it has to be set keeping in mind the peculiar circumstances of the accused. What is the financial earning capacity of the accused? Is he earning salary or is he earning daily wages? If daily wages, how much is he earning per day? Does he have savings? Does he have other property? What is the liability that he has, in the sense, how many dependents does he have? Is he the sole bread earner of the family? All of this is taken into account. This is the law of bail. Yeah, the foundation of that is a humanitarian concerns that you show. But these are things that are actually used in the law of bail. Therefore, will you say that, what the Supreme Court did by reducing 10,000 rupees to 1,000 rupees for that mason, for him to get bail, was a humanitarian gift that, it was Justice Krishna gave? No, you won't say that. It's an application, using the discretion of the court, an application of the law, which tells us that bail law is supposed to be on peculiar circumstances of a accused. This is a peculiar circumstance. As far as Safura is concerned, you can consider her pregnancy as a peculiar circumstance. Mind you, when I say that, I am not just harping on giving her bail just because she is pregnant. No. We have discussed in the beginning that, her case doesn't fall under UAPA. It doesn't fall under Chapter 4 or Chapter 6 of the UAPA. Therefore, that higher burden on her bail need not be kept, and therefore she is legally entitled to bail as well. Adding on to this factor as well. Okay. So therefore, there is nothing humanitarian about bail law at all. It's not a humanitarian gift that the center agrees to. Right? That's one aspect. Second aspect is, that's probably the last aspect that I will cover. After that, we can move on to certain questions. The last aspect is, why did the Solicitor General argue that, this case should not have any precedential value? And without hesitation, the court also agreed to that. This is where I want to sort of briefly talk about for the next 5 minutes, and then I'll close the lecture. The idea there is, It is true. So ultimately, now keeping aside all my arguments and the nuanced discussions away, if you look at the technically the Delhi High Court's order that was passed on June 24th, the 3-page order, that 3-page order does not discuss any law, right? Which is a problem that I have. The judge should not have, acceded to the tone set by the Solicitor General. I don't know for what. I'm not getting into that politics there, or that. I mean, I'm not talking about the politics in the the electoral sense or nothing like that. No. But I don't know what is the the on the ground strategy of the Solicitor General as to why they didn't want to sort of concede it as a precedent. Because if it is a precedent, then it can be used as a precedent for releasing other UAPA accused persons who are similarly situated as Safura. And also, if you get a chance to read that action taken report filed by the police on June 23rd, there they mention that it is not just Safura who is a pregnant lady right now in Tihar jail. There are others also. So if this becomes a precedent, then of course it should apply to all other UAPA accused as well. Probably they wanted to avoid that as a state, whatever it be. Typically, there is a situation where constitutional court judgments. Now, when I say constitutional court, a constitutional court is always a constitutional court in whichever capacity it sits, right? In this situation, it was sitting as a CRPC judge under section 439 CRPC. But nonetheless, the status is of a constitutional court for a high court, right? Now, in such a situation, a judgment will not have a precedential value, which is a matter of law, that if it is a judgment that is passed without the interpretation and the application of the relevant laws, right? Of course, there are other reasons like, a judgment is per incurium, that is, the judgment was passed without, keeping in mind a valid precedent that was binding on the judge. That is a per incurium judgment. I'm not going into that. But I'm going to one particular scenario or one particular factor that actually makes such judgments not having any precedential value. That is something called as consent decree. That is this, usually you will see this term in civil litigation of consent decree. But that principle or that the point of that particular discussion becomes relevant here as well. So what is a consent decree? Let me explain that with a hypothetical. Actually, a hypothetical that I took from a real life case. But we don't have time to go into the real case detailed discussions, and that's not necessary also. A consent decree is something like this. So, for example, let's say there is a number of persons who are dwelling on certain street pavements. Let's say, okay. There are certain pavements outside big buildings, and these daily wage workers, because they don't have other homes, they are sleeping at night over there, and they have created a partial settlement, a temporary settlement over there with huts and all of that. Now, based on the complaint of let's say the big business houses that are located there, the municipality commissioner, let's say the concerned municipality commissioner, orders an eviction of these pavement dwellers. Okay. Now, let's assume that somebody filed a PIL and it got challenged before the concerned high court. Okay. A PIL was filed. Now, when the PIL goes to the court comes and says, you know what, you may evict as the municipality commissioner, you evict them. It's okay, we can't get into that. But before eviction, you create another rehabilitation center for them. So eviction should only happen, after the state first creates a rehabilitation center to where these people can be moved out. Without that, don't do the eviction. The pavement dwellers are also happy. They're like, okay, we are fine with it. We don't care where we sleep. We just need a shelter above us. We just need a roof above us. The municipality commissioner, the state was also like, okay, fine. We are not getting into an adversarial mode, fine. So what is happening here is the court is bringing a proposal. Both the parties are agreeing to it. Mind you, in this particular scenario, if you look at most of the municipality legislations of each town and each city, you will not find this requirement there. And in this particular case, there was no requirement for the municipality commissioner to evict such payment dwellers only when they have already constructed a rehabilitation center. No, there is no requirement in the law. Therefore, what this court is saying is a non-legal proposal. Of course, it's the High Court, constitutional powers to do justice. Therefore, they set this proposal and both the parties are happy. There is nobody is objecting to it. So the judge is like, okay, based on this proposal which both the parties have consented to, therefore, order is passed and the matter is disposed of. This is essentially a consent decree. Why is it a consent decree? Either the parties, one of the parties have given a proposal or the court has given a proposal and all the three parties are, not objecting to it. Everybody consents to it. The three parties, matlab the court, the petitioner and the respondent. This is not a decision that was made by the interpretation of the Municipality Act. This is not a judgment order that was passed after interpreting the rights of payment dwellers under the Constitution or anything like that. No. This is a proposal based on justice that the judge brought out, and everybody seemed happy about it. That situation is called as a consent decree, meaning this judgment of that High Court will not have any precedential value in other similar payment dwellers case and eviction cases. Right? It will never have a precedential value because those new cases that will come out in a similar manner, where there is a dispute between the payment dwellers and the municipality, will have to be tested on its own merits by the interpretation of the law. That is a by default scenario. This is a consent decree. Now, such a consent decree need not happen in such a matter of bail law, which is already self-sufficient, which has already, imbibed within its legal jurisprudence the humanitarian factors that we keep talking about. There is this factor that bail judges keep in mind. Deep roots in the society. Deep roots in the society is, if I am an accused in a case and the prosecution is coming and saying that, I will abscond, then the judge will look at my situation. Does he have a house here? Does he have a business here? And the judge is like, okay, he has, 5 children and he has, both his grandmothers there, both his grandfathers there, and he is the only, income earning member of that family. The judge will say that, he has deep roots in this particular society. He will not abscond from this, because if he absconds, his entire family will be left alone. Therefore, he will not. This is an assumption that the court makes. Deep roots in the society is an argument that comes in relevance there. Because of the deep roots in the society, we are not fearing that he will abscond. Therefore, we need not deny bail. This is a pure humanitarian analysis, but it's a matter of law that has evolved through legal jurisprudence. Ever since cases like Motiram, like Balchand, like Gudikanti Narasimhalu, so many such cases that I can list down. This humanitarian principles which have been now, legislated or, judicialized into the law through court judgments is a matter of law. It's no more a matter of, certain humanitarian concessions or humanitarian, compromises. No. Therefore, in such a situation, there was no need to treat this sort of as a consent decree kind of a procedure. But at the end of the day, the judge seemed to have done so. And that, for me, the judge failed in its duty. When the prosecution has agreed that they are ready to fight the bail application on merits, then why not? Because it is the judge's duty to apply his or her discretion and grant the bail on the merits of the case. Right? So this, this humanitarian angle can be misused also in another way. What if actually in another situation there is a legit case where you need to detain that person in custody and cannot be released on bail? The state comes and says that, oh, humanitarian consideration, he is an elderly person, we are ready to release him. But the situation ideally would be that even though that person is elderly, the matter is grave and the person is going to abscond. There are evidences to show that. And the judge will come and give, okay, humanitarian ground. It will not be a precedent. That will end up in injustice. as far as the bail issue is concerned in that particular case. Therefore, yeah, of course, we can't prevent or we can't hold the Solicitor General or the lawyers of a case accountable to these arguments being made. But I think we can hold the judiciary accountable, because it is at the end of the day the judge's discretion to have been, to, you know, that should have been used here to, you know, give a full-fledged hearing to the case, especially keeping in mind the delay that has already happened. Right? Already you have given 5 days in detail to prepare the merits-based arguments to, you know, deny, to oppose the bail. And on June 23rd, the Solicitor General comes and agrees that, yes, sir, you know, we are ready to fight the bail, but, you know, we need time for instructions. After all of this, they are coming and saying that, you know, oh, humanitarian. Why didn't this humanitarian phase of the state, you know, why didn't this humanitarian phase of the state sort of get displayed all this while? If for you, pregnancy was the only ground, you could have done that earlier also. Before the Sessions Court also, you should have said. But there, you very well fought the merits of the case. But my thought is that if this case goes to the merits, and I am hoping that my argument that I raised all this while about the application of Section 437 to UAPA cases like Safura's case could and should have to be raised by the lawyers of Safura. I am sure lawyers like Nithya Ramakrishnan would have raised such an argument, I hope. If not, of course, they should have raised it. Because all of those arguments, if raised, can entitle Safura or any similarly situated person under the UAPA for bail. Especially, I am talking about, you know, accused persons of UAPA who are not accused of Chapter 4 or Chapter 6 offences. Right? Therefore, in such a scenario, you know, this entire proceedings that, you know, that took place before the court, before the Delhi High Court, the fact that, you know, the state displayed a, you know, it is a gift. The fact that the judge accepted that tone, the fact that it was never, you know, turned out to become a precedent, the fact that they didn't conduct a full-fledged hearing, these matters show us towards the lack of righteousness in the judicial proceedings in such cases, right? Because if the judicial proceedings are not done in a manner that it is supposed to be done, then this same procedure can be misused in one another case to either grant or deny bail, where the facts might be telling us different story otherwise, right? So apart from this, you know, one more curious thing that I would want again to all of you to sort of, you know, research on your own if you're interested is, the sealed cover business was carried out in this particular case as well. The Delhi police submitted certain things. Of course, we won't get to know what it is because it is in a sealed cover. Certain sealed cover documents were submitted to the court. I think there was a miscommunication between the Solicitor General and the Delhi police, because Delhi police on June 23rd filed an ATR. On June 24th, they filed a sealed cover document because the judge did not get into the merits of the case. Unfortunately, in my opinion, that sealed cover was never opened and it was sent back to the Solicitor General's or the Delhi Police's office by the court. Now that is also scary. That is another, you know, tangent that I am not going to get into. I may want to, get into that during the question answer session. But that's also a tangent that we need to be, you know, very suspicious about. Imagine if we had gone into the merits of this case, arguments would have been on the basis of the sealed cover documents which the petitioner's lawyer, or the applicant's lawyer would not have, you know, seen at all. That would be a lawyer defending the client's case with one hand tied at the back. Anyway, that's a subset discussion that I'm not sort of going into. So all in all, the main takeaways for me from this discussion is the interplay between CRPC and the UAPA, and how UAPA is very specific in terms of its bail restrictions in Section 43 D5. It's restricted only to very specific offences and the most serious offences based on terrorism and terrorist organizations, not to all UAPA offences. No. So don't get, in my opinion, don't get deceived when people say that, oh, UAPA makes bail difficult. Don't take it as a general statement. As lawyers, we are supposed to be very specific about each and every statement that we make, right? So yes, UAPA makes bail difficult in certain kinds of cases. Chapter 4, Chapter 6. Safoorah's case, as per the current evidences put forward by the court, doesn't attract that. Sessions Judge Dharmendra Rana's order clearly indicates that. There is nothing that the Sessions Judge recorded to say that Safoorah's case attracted Chapter 4 and Chapter 6. No. That's the main application. Therefore, my point that, in such a situation, when the specific law, that is the UAPA, doesn't exclude the general law still continues to apply. So all the bail law jurisprudence that is created under section 437 of CRPC will apply. I mean, I'm talking about all the rights and liabilities as well. I can't be selective to say that, all the rights given under such 437 is applicable to them. Even the liabilities under 437 are also applicable to Safoorah's case. That is the first inference that I want you to take. And second is the problems with the proceedings at the Delhi High Court in this particular matter. The fact that a bail proceeding was treated in that solely humanitarian sense, which doesn't warrant any, justification, in light of the fact that, yes, bail laws, the law in itself is humanitarian. I mean, ultimately, if I have to sort of talk in a very philosophical way, law is always the reflection of the humanity's goodness or badness, right? Goodness, if anything at all, is left, I would say. So therefore, the analogy that I use, like the right to education, no more can we say that, the state is giving you a gift. To a 14-year-old child, we can't come and go and tell him or her that, the state has given you a gift. Therefore, take it and go. Otherwise, you are to be blamed. No, it's an enforceable fundamental constitutional right. Similar is bail law. Therefore, the tone of the bail applications and the proceedings before the Delhi High Court is something that I reject completely, and I hoped that the judge would have not taken that tone and would have gone into the merits of the case. And second is the fact that that why was it not made a precedent, right? It should have been made a precedent. Why not? If the legitimate legal arguments that we discussed today are legal arguments that has some justification, I hope it has, others agree to that. Why can't it be used in a case and be a precedent for others? That's unfortunate, right? Because as I said, 437 has these provisions crystallized in its statute itself. Therefore, it is not anymore purely humanitarian. It is and if we want to create a nuanced distinction, it's a legal humanitarian ground. But ultimately, for me, it's an enforceable legal right, right? Of course, based on the discretion of the court, not on the discretion of the state. Therefore, I will end my discussion with that. I hope, it was clear for all of you. I hope all of you got to see the slides as well.